In this video, we will cover some simple and common materials that get used in most projects, and also some things you can do to make things easier on your artists. We'll cover a basic glass material. We'll cover how to modify fonts for both the user interface and the text renderer. A generic master material, an easy way to just simply grab some textures, put them on a item like a static mesh, and then have them simply work. And then an example of like a computer screen where the middle is glowing using our master material. We're going to look at the glass first. If we jump straight into this, we find our scene here set up with two things using glass. We have our little orb here, and then I have my door, which has glass for the panes. Now the glass material actually comes with the default starter content, and I've just simply pulled it in so I can show you how it works and explain the basics. One thing to note, if we pull up the material for the glass, you'll find this as our setup. It's pretty simple. We have our basics, which we'll cover, and then we have some things such as if the shader level for the device it's on supports Fresnel or not, and whether it works. The key here is all of these are parameterized, or basically adjustable at runtime and design time without having to edit the master material. In order to do that, you have to make sure you've created an instance of it. Any changes we make in the master material requires it to recompile, and it may take some time, and it's changes to everything. If we create a material instance, it gives us an item that is the material, but has all of our options that we've set up, our parameters for easy adjusting. So we can go ahead and look at those now. So here's the settings that comes with the glass material. If we were to, for example, turn on color glass, well, we can adjust the color of our glass. These are both using the same instance, so that's why they're both changing at the same time. And we can give it a nice frosted glass effect, just based on what we might want to set it to. In addition to that, we have the opacity. How clear is the glass? We can go either full clear or full solid. Basically, 0 would be fully transparent, and 1 would be fully opaque, so we can't see through it at all. And any value between that would, of course, be a partial. So maybe something like a frosted glass effect, where it's almost all completely solid. Now these all have default values you can reset to. We'll go and uncheck opacity, and we'll check out roughness. Roughness is basically how shiny it's going to be, honestly. By default, it's a 0 for roughness. If we bring this up to 1, it's completely rough. You'll notice our specular highlights pretty much disappear because we are completely shiny. Now, specular allows us to adjust basically how much specular there is inside of our reflection. Now, right now, we're not really getting a good example of this because of the way our scene is set up, but if you need to adjust your specular, there is an option to it. Refraction, basically how much the ends bend based on light, is the easiest way of thinking of it. You have your Fresnel and your refraction, which affect it. Let's just adjust our refraction, and we'll notice our changes here. If we go to 0, we're not going to see anything really happening along most of our edges. Now, if we adjust this refraction, we're going to start seeing it going in or out based on how much light is refracted inside of this. So you get something like a more solid item where it's refracting more on the edges, and you get something where it's just completely wonky if you go with a giant number. Now, Fresnel is basically how much of the edges are affected by what was the fall off for Fresnel. Basically, this allows you to kind of pull in your edges, give you that little bit of an effect. We could drop this down to 0, for example. Well, actually, it'd be more like 100. 100 is going to give us kind of like a zoomed in effect. Then we can adjust our refraction, and it'll adjust things such as how much of this we actually have when we're looking through our edges being blurred a little bit. So, I mean, it's our basic glass shader. It's pretty simple to work with. It comes in the engine in the starter content, and you can get some decent effects right out of the box. Our next shader is going to be our fonts shader. Now our fonts shader is basically giving us the ability to adjust the display of our fonts inside of our engine. By default, if we were to grab a text renderer and we drop into our scene, well, this is our text right here. And one thing you might notice, if we were to grab a light and put our light on it, is the light affects the text. Now, if we were in a really lit up scene or it's white like this, we might run into an issue where, well, you're going to have an issue, blowouts and things like that. The text uses the default text material opaque. If we were to look for this, we're going to find it in the engine, and we're going to find this is our material. And it's a pretty basic, simple material. Nothing super fancy about it. Now, the nice thing is because the material's in there and our fonts use the materials, we can just make a copy of it and edit it how we would like to. So in this case, I've done the same material, except I have changed it to go from the base color to the emissive. So in this case, if I was to take my default material here and we go to, I call it emissive text renderer, so let's find that one. We're going to get a different set of text. We're going to get text that is not affected anymore by our light. You'll notice it stays solid and our light doesn't affect it. Because we're not using our diffuse, our light itself has a nice constant, not our light, our text has a nice constant look to it. And of course we can adjust it, we can make it more emissive or less emissive. But it's a really simple way to adjust the text renderer text to get a more consistent look based on your issues and things like that. Now, the other version of text is going to be our UMG text, or Unreal Motion Graphics text. And I've actually got an example here of 4 different texts. We can see our plain text here, which uses no font material. And then we can see these 2, which use a similar font material for a gradient. And then this one, which actually uses a font material where we're driving some values based on time. And all of these are the same text, we just have a different material applied. If we were to go into our material for our gradient, for example, when you're creating a material for your user interface, you would change the domain to user interface, and you get a really simple output. And the nice thing is most material nodes will still work with that. Now here's something to note with the text. There are 2 different sets of coordinates for the text. There's texture coordinate 0 and texture coordinate 1. This is the difference between the 2 of them. If we were to zoom in and look, the picture, basically the material that I'm applying to this font is this material here. It's a gradient going from black at the top to green at the bottom. It's a linear gradient. Now these look similar, however, notice the differences between the tops and the bottoms. The actual gradient that we are outputting is black at the top and green at the bottom. However, if we look at this one, you don't really see black at the top. You see a darkening. And then we don't really see the green at the bottom. We see a darkening. We see a greenish, but not really as green as it should be. If we look at the second one here, we see black at the top and green at the bottom. And we actually see black at the top of every single letter and green at the bottom of every single letter. When you are doing your materials, this is the first one and this is the second one. Let me open this one up. The only difference between these 2 is the input texture coordinate. Index 0 basically refers to the entire thing. So our index is going to go from our top to our bottom, top to the bottom, left to right. The entire thing our material is applied to, the entire text block. UV coordinate 1, so we've changed this to 1 and input it, is each letter individually. So that is why this letter has black to green, this one has black to green, black to green. An easier way of seeing this may be if I change this to a U or an X gradient. We'll go ahead and apply this. We'll go ahead and look at it. And you'll notice a difference. Let's change the other one as well. Probably be helpful if we actually compared apples to apples here. And here's your biggest, you can see the difference easier. Black to green, or every single text element, black to green. So rather than the entire thing, it's basically mapping letter by letter rather than the entire block. That's an easy way to basically apply a material, and that's the difference between the UV1 and 0, depending on if you want it to be for the entire block or the individual letters. Now this last one is pretty simple. It is going to be this. And it is simply the same basic principle, except I'm driving a time period for a generated band. So basically my band is going to change over time. It's this little effect you see right here. But I'm using texture coordinate 1, so that way it applies to each letter individually, like this. And you get this little effect. It can use a normal material. It uses a UI domain material. So you can use time nodes and sine nodes and all that funky material to make this cool little effect to give you a little bit more of a change to your UMG fonts. The master material. So the master material was created in order to simplify things for your designers. Traditionally, when you get materials, you'll get things such as a diffuse mask, not diffuse mask. You'll get things such as a diffuse texture, maybe a normal map. You'll get things like a roughness map or a specular map, metallic map, an AO map. You'll get all the different maps. And a lot of the times, those maps, especially if they're single channel, like your roughness, if I was to find my materials, hiding somewhere in here, let's close the init content, textures. Yep, I had them in here, and of course, can't find them now. Oh, seriously. Okay, so let's just close material. Let's go to texture. We'll do this the hard way. Here we go. You have your diffuse mask, which is your, I keep saying mask, but your diffuse texture, which has values in all 4 channels. And then you have things with your packed mask textures, where each channel can contain something different. In this case, our red channel probably contains like a metallic mask, whereas our green channel contains like an AO map or a height map, something different. So what created was a master material that you can basically instance and plug in your values. So let's go ahead and grab this sphere here, and let's not use a sphere. Let's go ahead and use a cube. It'll be easier. We'll have a cube here, and we're going to go ahead and check out our master material. We'll grab the cube, we'll grab our master material instance, and we'll drop it on there, and we have our cube here. Now if we open up the master material instance, we actually have settings that we can change to allow us to easily drag and drop or select materials. So in this case, let's say I don't want to use a diffuse texture. Let's uncheck everything, all of these. We'll go to our default material. You'll notice it changes on the side. And we basically have our default material. Once we uncheck everything, diffuse texture, and there we go. And we have our, this is our base texture with our base nodes plugged in. It's just going to be something generic. Now let's say our artist wants us to make the brick wall. So we have our textures that I've shown you earlier, where we have 3 textures that we need to set up on here. Now we could go in and we could, for example, create a material that has all of these settings. We can grab a couple texture nodes. If you want to see how a basic one would be created, it would basically be material basic. And you're looking at something like this. You're going to have a texture node plugged into your base color, which is your diffuse, a texture node into your normal map, which will contain a normal map, and then you'll have more texture nodes based on if you have any other maps that you might need to set up. And in this case, if it's a metallic map that's packed, we might have to do something like that. Maybe we have another texture node in here, and in green we're going to put our ambient occlusion. And our artist might have to create individual materials for each individual map. Rather than doing that, what we can do is we have a master one here, which is using our parameters. This material basically allows us to choose how we want to set it up. So I'm in here, I want to make that wall. Well, we're going to use a diffuse texture, we're going to use a metallic texture, we're going to use a normal map, and we're going to use a roughness texture. So I'll go ahead and turn these ones on, like that. We'll go in here, and we don't have AO. Well, we do have ambient occlusion, right? No, we decided to go with roughness. Yeah, we'll go with roughness. Okay, so we're not going to use AO. Now for diffuse, we're going to use that brick texture, which I've already put in here because I was playing with it earlier. Let me shut off engine content. There we go. And we'll go with our diffuse texture. For emissive, we're not going to use emissive. Metallic, we have two options. We have a channel and a texture. In this case, I would select my metallic texture and then tell it is in the R channel. If it was in the green channel, for example, I would choose green. And you'll notice we get differences because it's using different maps. In this case, we're done with metallic and diffuse. We can go into our normal. We'll set up a normal map, and you can see it changes. And then we can have our roughness one. Now, our roughness, again, it's in a different channel. Same texture, different channel. So we just tell it it's in the green. And then we have our brick wall set up. And it's as simple as that. If you want to add or remove different ones, you just check or uncheck. Let's say we want to use emissive, for example, but we don't want to use the emissive texture. We just want to use emissive itself. We go in here, we'll set emissive strength to like 1. We're going to set our color to something like white. Now, this is completely silly, but, you know, again, it's a completely adjustable thing like that. And you can see it set up like that. Or, for example, we want to use emissive texture. We'll click that. We'll grab emissive texture. Now I've got a logo set up on top of everything, which is an emissive texture being plastered on top of everything. And of course, you can have just simply shut those off and they'll disable themselves. But the nice part about this is this one texture allows your designer to just come in. He can choose which things he wants to set up, which ones he wants to use, and then just simply, like for example, if I don't have a metallic or a roughness, I can just undo it, and then there's just my generic map using only normals or diffuse. If I'm not using normal, for example, I can disable use normal, and we would get our flat texture. Now it's a little shiny, so maybe we want to adjust our roughness up to a different value. We'll adjust our roughness up to like a 1, and then we'll get something that's a little less rough. Then we might want to adjust some other things, like we have a specular value in here. We might want to drop down, and you can basically play with your settings without having to adjust the actual material node graph itself. So that's an example of a master material. It makes things easier just by having one material that you can alter and then just simply set your textures inside of that and get the result that you want. Obviously, it's not going to fit every case, but it's really nice because it'll fit, you know, even if it fits most of your cases, it'll speed up productivity. The master material itself is pretty simple. Basically, all we're doing is using a switch and telling it to switch back and forth between either a predetermined value or a texture. Predetermined textures, predetermined value, textures, predetermined values, etc., all the way down. Normal map, no normal map, predetermined texture, predetermined value. So that's how the material itself works. And this material, of course, is included in all the sample content. Now here's an example of using our master material and making, for example, a glowing screen. If we go ahead and look at an example that I've created over here, we have what could be considered, you know, you could consider this a computer monitor. Let me go ahead, and that was kind of silly based on how I set this up. Let me just move this over. Here, let me undo this. Let me grab both of these and rotate. And we'll consider it like this. We have kind of like a little computer monitor or TV here. And the nice thing is this was set up just by using our master material and changing a few options. I created an instance of the master material. I created one for the monitor body and one for the screen. And then I just adjusted the values. Our body, for example, is going to be set up where it's simply using a diffuse color of black and has a fairly shiny roughness. So you can see here our reflective values, that when we adjust our roughness value, we go basically super rough, not really reflective, to a little bit more reflective, kind of like a plastic look. We did the same for the screen itself. We pull up our screen, we look at its values. It's got an emissive color of white, it's got a diffuse color of white, and it's got a strength of 4. So that way it's basically glowing. Emissive basically is your glow. If you drive the emissive color, value, or strength over 1, it basically becomes a glow. Here's the example of 1. And if we pump it up higher, every time we pump it up higher, the more and more glow we get. And that's an example of creating a glow. So you could use this for a street light or something like that really simply and efficiently, all using the same master material. We just adjusted a few settings. And there are just a few different examples of some materials. These are some basic, simple, common materials that are used in day-to-day programming and for game jams. Hopefully this will help you easily fix and solve some problems and give a little bit of flair to your project.